Yejide was created on a Saturday, when God had ample time to paint her a perfect ebony. No doubt about it, the finished work is living proof. The first time I saw her, I wanted to touch her jeans-clad knee, tell her there and then, "My name is Akin Ajayi. I am going to marry you." She was effortlessly elegant. Only girl on the row who didn't slouch, held her chin up, didn't bend sideways to lean on the orange armrests, sat straight, shoulders squared, hands linked, and held in front of her bare midriff. I couldn't believe I hadn't noticed her in the ticket queue downstairs. She glanced to her left some minutes before the lights went out. Our eyes met. She didn't look away like I expected, and I straightened up under her gaze. She looked me up and down, sized me up. It was not enough that she smiled at me before turning to face the big cinema screen. I wanted more. She seemed unaware of her effect, appeared oblivious to the way I was gawking at her, enthralled, already thinking about the words that would convince her to go out with me. Unfortunately, I couldn't talk to her at once. The lights went out right after I came up with the words I'd been trying to find, and the girl I was going out with at the time was seated between Yejide and me. I broke up with the girl that night, right after the movie. I did it while we stood together in the foyer of Oduduwa Hall in Ife, as the crowd that had come to watch the film show flowed past us. I said to her, "Please, find your way to your hostel. I'll see you tomorrow." I clasped my hands together apologetically, though I didn't feel sorry. Would never feel sorry. I left her standing there with her mouth slightly open. I pushed through the throng, searched for a beauty in blue jeans, platform sandals, and white t-shirt that showed off her belly button. I found her. Yejide and I were married before the end of that year. I loved Yejide from the very first moment. No doubt about that. But there are things even love can't do. Before I got married, I believed love could do anything. I learned soon enough that it couldn't bear the weight of 4 years without children. If the burden is too much and stays too long, even love bends, cracks, comes close to breaking, and sometimes does break. But even when it's in 1,000 pieces around your feet, that doesn't mean it's no longer love. After 4 years, nobody else cared about love. My mother didn't. She talked about my responsibility to her as a first son, reminded me about the 9 months when the only world I knew was inside her. She focused on the hardship of the last 3 months, how she couldn't get comfortable in bed and had to spend her nights in a cushioned armchair. Soon, Moami began talking about Juon, my half-brother, the first son of my father's second wife. It had been years since Moami had used him as an example. When I was much younger, she was always talking about him. "Juon never comes home with dirty uniforms. Why is your shirt dirty? Juon has never lost his school sandals. This is the 3rd pair you've lost this term. Juon is always home by 3. Where do you go after school? How come Juon came home with prizes and you didn't? You are the first son in this family. Do you know what that means? Do you know what that means at all? Do you want him to take your place?" She stopped talking about Juon when he decided to learn a trade after secondary school because his mother couldn't afford to pay his university fees. Guess Muami felt there was no way a boy who was training to become a carpenter could ever measure up to her university-trained children. For years she didn't talk about Juon and appeared to have lost interest in his life until she wanted me to marry another wife. Then she told me, as if I didn't already know, that Juon already had 4 children, all boys. This time she didn't stop with Juon, but reminded me that all my half-brothers now had children. After I'd been married to Yejide for 2 years, my mother began to show up in my office on the first Monday of every month. She didn't come alone. Each time, she brought a new woman with her, a potential second wife. She never missed a first Monday, not even when she was ill. We had an agreement. As long as I continued to let her bring the women to my office, she would never embarrass my wife by showing up at our home with any of her candidates. She would never mention her efforts to Yejide. When my mother threatened that she would start visiting my wife each week with a new woman if I didn't choose one within a month, I had to make a decision. I knew my mother was not a woman who made empty threats. I also knew that Yejide couldn't bear that kind of pressure. It would have broken her. Of the string of girls my mother paraded through my office every month, Fumi was the only one who didn't insist on moving in with Yejide and me. Fumi was the obvious choice because she didn't want much from me. Not in the beginning. She was an easy compromise. She accepted a separate flat, miles away from Yejide and me, didn't ask for more than a weekend every month, and a reasonable allowance. She agreed that she would never be the one to go with me to parties and public engagements. I didn't see Fumi for months after I agreed to marry her. I told her I had a lot going on at work and wouldn't be able to see her for a while. Someone must have sold the A patient wife wins her husband's heart in the end, lying to her. She didn't argue with me. She just waited until I came to terms with the fact that she was now a part of my life. It had been more immediate with Yejide. I spent the first month after I met her driving 2 hours every day to be with her. I'd leave the office at 5 and spend about 30 minutes driving down to Ife. It took another 15 minutes to get through the city to the university gates. Usually, I would enter F101 in Moremi Hall, about an hour after leaving Ilesha. I did this every day until one evening, Yejide came out into the corridor and shut the door behind her instead of letting me in. She told me never to come back. She said she did not want to see me again. But I didn't stop. I was at F101 every day for 11 days, smiling at her roommates, trying to convince them to let me in. On the 12th day, she answered the door, came out to stand with me in the corridor. We stood side by side as I begged her to tell me what I had done wrong. A mix of odours from the kitchenette and toilets wafted in our direction. It turned out that the girl I'd been dating before I met her had been to Yejide's room to threaten her. The girl had claimed that we had had a traditional wedding. I don't do polygamy, Yejide said on the evening she finally told me what was going on. Another girl would have found a roundabout way of saying she wanted to be an only wife. Not Yejide. She was direct, up front. I don't either, I said. Look, Akin, just let us forget it. This thing, this thing. I'm not married. Look at me. Come on, look at me. If you want to, we can go to that girl's room right now, and I'll confront her, ask her to produce the wedding pictures. Her name is Bisade. I don't care. Yejide didn't say anything for a while. She leaned against the door, watching people come and go in the corridor. I touched her shoulder. She didn't pull away. So, I was being silly, she said. You owe me an apology, I said. I didn't mean it. Our relationship was still at the point where it didn't matter who was wrong or right. We hadn't arrived at the place where deciding who needed to apologize started another fight. Sorry, but you know people have all sorts of... Sorry. She leaned into me. All right. I grinned, as her thumb drew invisible circles along my arm. So, Akin, you can confess all your secrets to me now, dirty or clean. Maybe a woman who has children for you somewhere. There were things I could have told her, should have said to her. I smiled. I've got a few dirty socks and underwear. How about you? Any dirty panties? She shook her head. Finally, I spoke the words that had been dancing on my tongue since the beginning, or a version of them. I said to her, Yejide, Makinde, I am going to marry you. Chapter 4. For a while, I did not accept the fact that I had become a first wife, an Iyale. Iya Martha was my father's first wife. When I was a child, I believed she was the unhappiest wife in the family. My opinion did not change as I grew older. At my father's funeral, she stood beside the freshly dug grave with her narrow eyes narrowed even further and showered curses on every woman my father had made his wife after he married her. She had begun, as always, with my long-dead mother, since she was the second wife, the one who had made Iya Martha a first among not-so-equals. I refused to think of myself as first wife. It was easy to pretend that Fumi did not even exist. I continued to wake up with my husband lying on his back beside me in bed, his legs spread-eagled, a pillow over his face to shut out the light from my bedside lamp. I would pinch his neck until he got up and headed for the bathroom, responding to my greetings with a nod or a wave. He was incoherent in the mornings, incapable of putting words together before a cup of coffee or a cold shower. A couple of weeks after Fumi came into our home for the first time, our phone rang shortly before midnight. By the time I sat up in bed, Akin was halfway across the room. I pulled my bedside lamp's cord twice, and all its 4 bulbs came on, flooding the room with light. Akin had picked up the phone and was frowning as he listened to the person on the other end of the line. After he returned the phone to its cradle, he came to sit beside me in bed. That was Aliyu. He's head of operations at the head office in Lagos. He called me to say we shouldn't open the bank to customers tomorrow. He sighed. There has been a coup. Oh my God, I said. We sat in silence for a while. I wondered if anyone had been killed, if there would be chaos and violence in the following months. Though I had been too young to remember the events, I knew that the coups of 1966 had ultimately thrust the country into a civil war. I comforted myself by thinking about how the tension after the last coup, which had made General Buhari head of state just 20 months before, had dissipated within a few days. The country had decided then that it was tired of the corrupt civilian government Buhari and his colleagues had ousted. But is it certain that the coup plotters succeeded? Looks like it. Aliyu says they have already arrested Buhari. Let's hope these ones don't kill anybody. I pulled the bedside lamp's cord once, switching off 3 of the bulbs. This country. Akin sighed as he stood up. I'm going to go downstairs and check the doors again. So, who is in charge now? I lay back in bed, though I would not be able to go back to sleep. He didn't say anything about that. We should know in the morning. We did not know in the morning. There was a broadcast at 6 a.m. by an army officer who condemned the previous government and didn't tell us anything about the new one. Akin left for the office after the broadcast so that he could arrive at work before any protests broke out. I stayed at home, knowing already that my stylists in training would not come to the salon after listening to the news that morning. I left the radio on and tried to call everyone I knew in Lagos to make sure they were safe, but the phone lines had been severed by then, and I could not get through. I must have dozed off after listening to the news at noon. Akin was home by the time I woke up. He was the one who informed me that Ibrahim Babangida was the new head of state. The most unusual thing about the next few weeks was that Babangida referred to himself and came to be referred to not just as head of state, but as president, as if the coup counted as an election. On the whole, things appeared to go on as usual, and like the rest of the country, my husband and I went back to our usual routine. Most weekdays, Akin and I ate breakfast together. It was usually boiled eggs, toast, and lots of coffee. We liked our coffee the same way, in red mugs that matched the little flowers on the placemats, without milk, and with 2 cubes of sugar each. At breakfast, we discussed our plans for the day ahead. We talked about getting someone to fix the leaking roof in the bathroom, discussed the men Babangida had appointed to the National Council of Ministers, considered assassinating the neighbour's dog, who would not quit yelping during the night, and debated whether the new margarine we were trying out was too oily. We did not discuss Funmi. We did not even mention her name by mistake. After the meal, we would carry the plates together to the kitchen and leave them in the sink to be cleaned later. Then we would wash our hands, share a kiss, and go back into the sitting room. There, Akin would pick up his jacket, sling it over a shoulder and leave for work. I would go upstairs to shower and then head for my salon. And so we continued, days sliding into weeks, weeks into a month, as though it was still just the 2 of us in the marriage. Then one day, after Akin had left for work, I went back upstairs to have my bath and discovered that a section of the roof had collapsed. It was raining that morning, and the pressure of the gathering rainwater must have finally pushed through the already soggy asbestos and ripped the leaky square open in the middle so that water poured through it into the bathtub. I tried to find a way to bathe in that tub anyway, because I had never used any of the other bathrooms in the house since we had got married, but the rain would not stop, and the torn asbestos was located just so that I could not fit myself into any corner of my own bathtub without getting hit by the rainwater or bits of wood and scraps of metal that were making their way into the tub along with the water. After I called Akin's office and left a message with his secretary about the roof, for the very first time, I had to have my bath in the guest bathroom down the hallway. And there, in a space that was unfamiliar, I considered the possibility that I might end up having to take many showers in that tiny shower stall, if Funmi decided to start coming over and insisted on spending her nights in the master bedroom. I rinsed off the soap suds and went back to the master bedroom, my bedroom, to get dressed for work. When I checked on the state of the bathroom before going downstairs, the damage had not got any worse, and the water was still flowing directly into the tub. By the time I unfurled my umbrella and dashed for the car, the downpour had become torrential. The wind was strong, and it tried its best to wrestle the umbrella from me. My shoes were wet by the time I got into the car. I took them off and put on the flat slippers that I used for driving. When I turned my key in the ignition, I got nothing, just a useless click. I tried again and again without any luck. I had never had a problem with my faithful Blue Beetle since Akin gave it to me after we got married. He took it in for servicing regularly and checked the oil and whatever else every week. The rain was still pouring outside, and there was no use walking to my salon, even though it wasn't too far from the estate. The wind had already snapped several branches off the trees in our neighbour's front yard, and it would have wrecked my umbrella within minutes. So I sat in the car, watching more branches struggle against the wind until they were broken and fell to the ground, still lush and green. Funmi broke into my thoughts in moments like that, in the moments that did not submit themselves to my routine, and the idea that I too had become one of those women who would eventually be declared too old to accompany her husband to parties would flutter into my mind. But even then, I could trap those thoughts and keep them caged in a corner of my mind, in a place where they could not spread their wings and take over my life. That morning, I brought out a notepad from my bag and began to write down the list of new items that I needed in the salon. I drew up a budget for my planned expansion for more salons. There was no point in thinking about Fumi. Akin had assured me that she would not be a problem, and nothing had happened yet to prove him wrong. But I did not tell any of my friends about Fumi. When I spoke with Sophia or Chimdi on the phone, it was about my business, their babies, and Akin's promotion at work. Chimdi was an unmarried mother, and Sophia was a third wife. I did not think either of them could give me any useful advice about my situation. A roof that had caved in, and a car that would not start. If her day had begun like that, Martha would have gone back to her room and spent the day behind locked doors and shut windows because the universe was trying to tell her something. The universe was always trying to tell that woman something. I was not Martha, so when the rain slowed to a drizzle, I turned the key in the ignition one last time and got out of the car in my slippers. With my handbag slung over my shoulder, umbrella in one hand and wet shoes in the other, I walked to work. My salon held the warmth of several women who sat in the cushioned chairs and submitted themselves to the mercies and ministries of the wooden comb, the hooded hairdryer, to my hands and the hands of the stylists I was training. Women who quietly read a book, women who called me my dear sister, women who made loud jokes that still had me laughing days later. I loved the place, the combs, the curlers, and the mirrors on every wall. I started making money from hairdressing during my first year at the University of Ife. Like most female freshers, I lived in Mozambique Hall. Every evening for the first week after I moved into the hostel, I went from room to room, telling the other girls that I could plait their hair for half the price they would pay to regular hairdressers. All I had was a small wooden comb, and while I lived at the university, the only other thing I invested in was a plastic chair for my customers to sit in. That chair was the first thing I packed when I moved to Moremi Hall in my second year. I did not earn enough to buy a dryer, but by my third year, I was making enough money for my upkeep, and whenever Martha decided to withhold the monthly allowance my father routed through her, I did not go hungry. I moved to Ilesha after my wedding, and though I drove to Ife for classes on weekdays, it was impossible to continue the hairdressing business as before. For a while, I wasn't making any money. Not that I needed to. Apart from the housekeeping stipend, Akin gave me a generous personal allowance. But I missed hairdressing, and did not like knowing that if for some reason Akin stopped giving me money, I would not even be able to afford a packet of chewing gum. For the first few months of our marriage, Akin's sister Ariola was the only woman whose hair I wove. She often offered to pay me, but I refused her money. She didn't like elaborate styles, and always asked me to weave her hair into the classic shuku. Weaving her tresses into straight lines that stopped in the middle of her head bored me after a while, so I persuaded her to let me spend 10 hours plaiting her hair into 1,000 tiny braids. Within a week, Ariola's colleagues at the College of Education were begging her to introduce them to her hairdresser. Initially, I attended to the growing stream of women beneath a cashew tree in our backyard. But Akin soon found a salon space that he told me would be perfect. I was reluctant about opening up a real salon, because I knew I would only be able to work there over the weekends until I got my degree. Akin convinced me to take a look at the place he'd found, and once I stepped into that room, I could see that it would really be perfect. I tried to contain my excitement by telling him it was not sensible to spend money on a place that would be closed for 5 days a week. He saw through me, and a few hours later, we held hands in the landlord's living room as he negotiated the rent. I was still using that salon space when he married Fumi. And that morning, although I arrived later than usual because of the rain and the trouble with my car, I was still the first in the salon. None of my apprentices was in sight when I unlocked the doors. They usually came in earlier to set up shop for the day. But even as I switched on the lights, the pitter-patter of rain picked up speed until it sounded like 100 hooves were pounding on the roof. There was little chance that the girls would make it across town before the rain let up again. I switched on the radio my father had given me when I went to university. It was now broken in several places, but I'd put it back together with duct tape. I fiddled with the dial until I found a station that was playing music I did not recognize. Then I started setting out shampoos and pomades, styling gels and curling irons, bowls of relaxers and bottles of hairspray. I did not bother to check if walking in the rain had ruined my braids in spite of the umbrella. If I looked in the mirror, I would have had to examine the shape of my face. My small eyes, my big nose, the things that could have been wrong with the dip of my chin or my lips, all the different ways in which any man, Akin specifically, might find Fumi more attractive. I did not have time to indulge in self-pity, so I kept on working, because handling the equipment focused my thoughts on hair. After the rain stopped, the girls trickled in one after the other. The last one came in just before our first customer showed up. I grabbed a wooden comb, parted the woman's hair in the middle, dipped 2 fingers into the sticky pomade, and started my day. Her hair was thick and full, The tresses crackled softly as I wove them in tiny rows that gathered at the nape of her neck. There were 4 people waiting when I was through with her. I moved from head to head, sectioning hair, weaving strands into patterns, snipping off split ends and dispensing advice to the girls in training. It was bliss. Time slipped by, and soon it was well past noon. By the time I took a break for lunch, my wrists were hurting. Almost everyone wanted weaving and braiding that morning, and few easy wash and sets were coming our way. That afternoon, I went for rice cooked in iaran leaves and topped with palm oil stew. There was a woman on that street who cooked it so well that after enjoying the bits of smoked fish and cowhide in the stew, I always had to fight the urge to lick the leaves clean. It was the kind of food that demanded a moment's pause after the plate was empty, and induced a level of contentment that had me staring into space while the salon buzzed around me. Outside, the sky was still a threatening indigo, although the rain had finally stopped. Cold air swept into the salon in drafts and battled the hairdryers to set the room temperature. I thought she was a customer when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a moment, the overcast sky hanging behind her like a bad omen. She looked around the room with a frown on her face, until she saw me. Then she smiled and came to kneel beside me. She was so beautiful. She had the kind of face that would complement any hairstyle, a face that would have other women looking longingly after her in the market, a face that would have some of them asking who her hairdresser was. "Good morning, our mother," Fumi said. Her words pierced me. I was not her mother. I was not anybody's mother. People still called me Yejide. I was not Iya this or Iya that. I was still merely Yejide. That thought tied my tongue and made me want to pull hers out of her mouth. Years before, nothing would have stopped me from punching her teeth down her throat. When I was a student at Ife Girls High School, I was known as Yejide Terror. I got into fights every other day. In those days, we would wait until school was over before starting a fight. We would leave the vicinity of the school compound and find a path that none of the teachers passed through on their way home. And I always won. Not once, not one single time did I lose. I lost a few buttons, broke a tooth, got a bloody nose many times, but I never lost. I never got one single grain of sand in my mouth. Whenever I arrived home late and bloodied up from another fight, my stepmothers would scold me loudly and promise to punish me for my disgraceful behavior. At night, they whispered, with washed-out wrappers tied around their shrunken breasts. They whispered instructions to their children not to be like me. After all, their children had mothers, living women who cursed and cooked, had businesses and bushy armpits. Only motherless children like me, could misbehave like that. And it was not just that I did not have a mother, but the one I once had, the one who died seconds after she had pushed me out into the world, was a woman without lineage. And who impregnates a woman with no lineage? Only a stupid man who happened to be, well, her husband. But that was not the point. The point was that when there was no identifiable lineage for a child, that child could be descended from anything, even dogs, witches, or strange tribes with bad blood. The third wife's children obviously had bad blood, since insanity occurred frequently in her family, but at least that was known bad blood. My possible bad blood was of unknown origin, and that was worse, as evidenced by the way I was disgracing my father by fighting like a street dog. The whispered discussions in the rooms that each wife shared with her children were eventually reported to me in detail by my half-siblings. The words did not bother me. It was a game the wives played, trying to prove which woman had produced a superior stock of children. It was the threats that were never carried out, even when my fighting became a daily event. That bothered me. It was the whips that were not unleashed, the extra chores that were not assigned, the dinners that were not withheld, that reminded me that none of them really cared. "Our mother," Fumi said. She was still on her knees. I swallowed my memories like an oversized bitter pill. Fumi had placed her hands on my lap. Her manicure was perfect. The nails were painted hibiscus red, like the matching mugs Akin and I had used to drink coffee that morning. "Our mother." I never painted my fingernails anymore. I used to paint them when I was at university. Was it the nails that made her attractive to him? How did he feel when she raked those beautiful nails across his chest? Did his nipples tighten? Did he moan? I wanted... No. I needed to know immediately, in detail. What did she have of him that had always been just mine? What would she have that I had never had? His child? "Our mother." "Who is your mother? You better get up now," I said. There was an empty chair next to me, but she chose to sit on the arm of my chair. "Why are you here? Who showed you this place?" I whispered, because the background chatter between customers and stylists had stopped. Somebody had turned off the radio, and the salon had gone quiet. "I just thought I should come to greet you." "At this time of the day? Are you jobless?" It was an insult, but she took it as a question.
No, I don't have a job since our husband is taking good care of me.
Her voice rose as she said, "Our husband," and it was obvious that everyone in the room had heard her. Chairs creaked as customers shifted in their seats and leaned back as much as possible in their attempts to listen in on the conversation.
What? Our husband is a very caring man. He has been taking good care of me. We thank God that he has enough money for all of us.
She smiled at the top of my head. I glared at her reflection in the mirror opposite us. Enough money for what?
For us, our mother. That is why a man works, Abi. For his wives and children.
Some of us have jobs, I said, keeping my clenched fists firmly by my side. You have to leave so that I can do mine. She smiled into the mirror.
I will visit tomorrow afternoon, ma. Maybe you will be less busy then.
Did she expect me to smile back? Fumi, don't let me see your broomstick legs in this place ever again.
Our mother, there is no need for all this, so we have to be friends, at least for the sake of the children we will have.
She went on her knees again.
I know people say you are barren, but there is nothing God cannot do. I know that once I conceive, your own womb too will be opened. If you say I should not come here, I will not come. But I want you to know that this bitterness can be one of the things causing the barrenness. Oh, goodbye, ma.
She was smiling as she rose to her feet and turned to leave. I stood up and grabbed the back of her dress. You, this wretched, this evil Egbere, who are you calling barren? I was not prepared for the confrontation. Even my insult was off the mark. Fumi did not look like the mythical Egbere. She was not short. She was not carrying a mat or weeping incessantly. In fact, when she turned to face me, she was smiling. I was surrounded by customers and stylists before I could land the first slap on her cheek.
Leave her alone, the women said. Let her go.
They pulled my hands from Fumi's dress and pushed me until I was back in my seat.
My dear sister, please calm down. Just take it easy.
Chapter 5. I bought new mugs.
You know why I don't like white mugs,
Akin said at breakfast.
Please, enlighten me,
I said.
You can always see the coffee stains too clearly.
Really? He pulled at his tie and frowned.
You sound angry. Is something wrong?
I spread more margarine on my toast, stirred my coffee and clenched my jaw. I was prepared to keep my mouth shut about why I was upset, until Akin asked me at least 5 times. But he did not even give me a chance to sulk.
I don't like these white mugs.
He held a finger up and paused to drink some water.
Where are the old ones?
I broke them. His mouth formed an O that it did not expel, and he took another bite of toast. I could see that he assumed I had simply knocked the mugs over by mistake, or dropped them as I was putting them away. There was no reason for him to think that I had slammed each hibiscus-red mug against the kitchen wall as the cuckoo clock in the sitting room chimed at midnight. He could never have imagined that I had swept the broken pieces into a dustpan, put them in a small mortar and pounded them until I was sweating from every pore and wondering if I had lost my mind.
You know the internal auditors from the headquarters were in the office yesterday. We were so busy with them. I forgot to send someone to look at that roof. Today Your wife came to my salon yesterday.
Fumi?
Who else?
I leaned forward in my chair.
Or do you have another wife that I don't know about?
It was an idea I had not been able to shake, since Fumi had left my salon the previous day, the possibility that there could have been other wives out there, in Ilesha, in any other city, other women that he could love, other women who made him less mine. Akin covered one half of his face with a hand.
Yejide, I've explained my agreement with Fumi to you. You shouldn't let her bother you.
She said you are taking good care of her. My words did not carry the power that I wanted them to, because I could not find any of the anger and disdain I had directed at Fumi the previous day. I wanted to be angry with him, so I kept speaking, trying with my words to reach past what I really felt, to the anger I was supposed to feel.
What does that mean? Explain to me what good care means.
Sweetie.
Hold it. Just hold it there. Please don't sweetie me again this morning.
But I did want him to call me sweetie again. Only me, and no one else. I wanted him to reach across the table, hold my hand and tell me we would be all right. And I still believed then that he would know what to do and what to say, just because he was Akin.
Yejide,
where were you yesterday night? I waited until well past midnight for you to come home. Where did you go?
The sports club.
Sports club? You must think I'm a fool. When do they close at the sports club? Tell me, when? He sighed and glanced at his watch.
You want to start policing me? You said nothing would happen between you and that girl. He grabbed his jacket and stood up. I need to get to work. You are deceiving me, Abby! I followed him to the door, grappling for words to tell him I did not really want to fight with him, to explain that I was afraid that he would leave me and I would be all alone in the world again. Hakim, God will deceive you, I promise you. God will deceive you the way you are deceiving me. He shut the door, and I watched him through the glass panes. He was all wrong. Instead of holding his briefcase in his hand, he gripped it to his side with his left arm, so that his body tilted a little to the left, and he looked as though he was about to double over. His jacket was not slung over a shoulder, but clutched in his right hand. The edge of a sleeve touched the ground and slid down the porch steps and through the grass as he walked towards his black Peugeot. I turned away as he put the car into reverse. His coffee mug was still full. Not one drop had left the cup. I sat in his chair, finished my toast and his, and drank up his coffee. Then I tidied up the dining table and took the dirty dishes to the kitchen. I washed up, and took care to make sure there was no coffee stain left in the mugs. I did not feel like going to work, because I was not ready for another confrontation with Fumi. It was clear to me that she would not stop showing up at the salon simply because I said so. I knew that women like Fumi, the kind of women who chose to be second, third, or seventh wives, never back down easily, ever. I had watched them arrive and evolve in my father's house. All those different mothers who were not mine. They always came in with a strategy, hidden under their wrappers. They were never as stupid or as agreeable as they first seemed. And it was Iamata, who was always caught unawares, stunned, without a strategy or a plan of her own. It was becoming obvious that I had been a fool to believe for 1 second that Akin had Fumi under control. So I decided to take the day off, to think things through. I stopped by the salon for a few minutes to give instructions to Debbie, the most senior stylist in training. Then I took a taxi to Odo Iru, to get Silas, the mechanic who usually repaired my Beetle. Silas was surprised to see that I had come to his shop alone, and asked after Akin. Throughout the drive to my place, he kept telling me in different ways that he would prefer to discuss the repairs with Akin before he did anything. I cooked while he worked on the Beetle, and offered him lunch when he was done. He washed his hands outside and ate the yam pottage quickly. I sat and watched him as he ate. I talked to him, and he stared at me, grunting now and then, but mostly he just stared at me with a look of wonder, as though he did not know what he could say in reply to my non-stop chatter. When he stood up to leave, I counted out the amount he had charged and gave the bills to him. Then I followed him to his car, still talking as he drove off. I sat on the porch, calling out greetings to neighbours who passed by, until Debbie came to give me an account of the money that had been made at the salon. I invited her in and offered her some food, but she turned it down and said she was not hungry. So I insisted that she should have a bottle of Maltina. After she went home, there was nothing left to do. The car had been fixed, plates washed, and dinner was ready, even though I knew by then that Akin would not be home until midnight. I could not delay thinking about Fumi any longer. I went through several possibilities, from beating her to a pulp the next time she showed up in the salon, to asking her to move in with us so I could keep her close enough to have my eye on her at all times. It did not take long to realize that the ultimate solution had little to do with her. I simply had to get pregnant, as soon as possible, and before Fumi did. It was the only way I could be sure I would stay in Akin's life. I believed I was Moami's favourite daughter-in-law. As a child, it was expected that I would call my stepmothers Moami. Even my father encouraged me to, but I refused. I stuck to calling them Mama. And whenever my father was not around, some of the women would slap me just because I refused to honour them by calling them my mother. I did not refuse because I was being stubborn or trying to defy them, as a number of them concluded. My mother had become an obsession for me, a religion, and the very thought of referring to another woman as mother seemed sacrilegious, a betrayal of the woman who had given up her life for me to live. One year, the Anglican church my family attended celebrated Mothering Sunday with a special service. After the vicar delivered his sermon, he summoned everyone who was below the age of 18 to the front of the church because he wanted us to honour mothers with a song. I must have been 12 at the time, but I didn't get up until an usher poked me in the back. We sang a song that everyone already knew, an expansion of a popular saying. I managed the first line. Iya newura, iyebiye, tia kolefowara. Before biting my tongue to choke back tears, the words, "Mother is gold. Mother is treasured gold that cannot be bought with money," resonated with me more than any homily I'd ever heard. I knew by then that my mother could not be replaced with money, by a stepmother, or anyone else. And I was sure I would never call any woman Mommy. Yet every time Akin's mother wrapped me in her fleshy embrace, my heart sang Mommy,
and when I called her the venerated title, it did not cling to my throat and refuse to climb out the way it used to when my stepmothers tried to slap it out of me. She lived up to the name, taking my side if any issue I had with Akin came to her attention, assuring me that it was a matter of time before I got pregnant for her son, insisting that my miracle would be waiting once I turned the right corner. When Mrs. Adeolu, a pregnant customer, told me about the mountain of jaw-dropping victory, I went to Mommy that same day to discuss it with her. I needed her to authenticate the information. She was a treasure house of knowledge about such things. Even if she did not know anything about a miracle house, she usually knew whom to ask, and once she had checked out the stories, she was always prepared to accompany me to the ends of the earth to seek out a new solution. There was a time when I would have ignored Mrs. Adeolu's words, a time when I did not believe in prophets who lived on mountains or priests who worshipped beside rivers. That was before I had so many tests done in the hospital, and every one of them showed that there was nothing preventing me from getting pregnant. I hoped at one point that the doctors would find something wrong, anything to explain why my period still showed up every month, years after my marriage. I wished they would find something they could treat or cut out. They found nothing. Akin also went in to get tested, and came back saying that the doctors had found nothing wrong with him. Then I stopped waving aside my mother-in-law's suggestions, stopped thinking that women like her were uncivilized and a little crazy. I became open to alternatives. If I was not getting what I wanted in one place, what was wrong with searching elsewhere? My parents-in-law lived in Ayeso, an old section of town that still had a few mud houses. Their house was a brick building, with a front yard partially enclosed by a low cement fence. When I arrived at the house, Mommy was sitting on a low stool in the front yard shelling groundnuts into a rusty tray that sat on her lap. She looked up as I approached, and looked down again. I swallowed, and my step slowed. There was something wrong. Mommy always greeted me by shouting, "Yejide, my wife!" The words were as warm as the embrace that usually followed them. "Good evening, Mommy." My knees trembled as they touched the concrete floor. "Are you pregnant now?" she said, without looking up from the tray of groundnuts. I scratched my head. "Are you barren and deaf too? I say, are you pregnant? The answer is either yes, I am pregnant, or no, I still haven't been pregnant for a single day in my life." "I don't know." I stood up and backed away until she was not within the reach of my clenched fist. "Why won't you allow my son to have a child?" She slapped the tray of groundnuts on the floor and stood up. "I don't manufacture children. God does." She marched towards me and spoke when her toes were touching the tips of my shoes. "Have you ever seen God in a labor room giving birth to a child? Tell me, Yejide, have you ever seen God in the labor ward? Women manufacture children, and if you can't, you are just a man. Nobody should call you a woman." She gripped my wrists and lowered her voice to a whisper. "This life is not difficult, Yejide. If you cannot have children, allow my son to have some with me. See, we are not asking you to stand up from your place in his life. We are just saying you should shift so that someone else can sit down." "I am not stopping him, Mommy," I said. "I have accepted her. She even spends the weekends in our house now." She held her thick waist and laughed. "I am a woman too. Do you think I was born last night? Tell me, why has Akin never touched Fumi? He has been married to her for over 2 months. Tell me why he has not removed a wrapper once. Tell me, Yejide." I stifled a smile. "It is not my business what Akin does with his wife." Mommy lifted my blouse and laid a wrinkled palm on my stomach. "Flat as the side of a wall," she said. "You have had my son between your legs for 2 more months, and still your stomach is flat. Close your ties to him, I beg you. We all know how he feels about you. If you don't chase him away, he won't touch Fumi. If you don't, he will die childless. I beg you, don't spoil my life. He is my first son, Yejide. I beg you in the name of God." I closed my eyes, but tears still forced their way past my eyelids. Mommy sighed. "I have been good to you. I beg you in the name of God, Yejide, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me." She held me then, pulled me into her arms and muttered words of comfort. Her embrace held no warmth. Her words sat in my stomach, cold and hard, where a baby should have been.